evening. Good evening, everyone. Oh my goodness, it's such a pleasure to be here. Please allow me to introduce myself. My name is Eliza Blackwell Dupre, and I am here today to talk to you about one of the most tragic events of the beginning of the 20th century. And by this, of course, I mean the sinking of the Titanic. Now, while I know that most of you are well aware of the main facts of the sinking, I thought that today we could talk perhaps a little bit about some of the lesser-known facts and also about La Belle Époque, the era surrounding the sinking and this incredible turning of the century. This has been a pivotal time, and I feel that I represent it well, having been born in 1880, and I look good for my age, right? And having had my daughter in 1900, my 20th century baby. Now, I think in my lifetime, I never thought that my life differed all that much from my mother's. But the way things are going, I think my daughter's life is going to be much different than my life. So, La Belle Époque, which is French for beautiful era, is a period of European social history that started at the beginning of the 19th century and lasted until the outbreak of the Great War in 1914. It's also considered the Edwardian era. And it was named in retrospect when it began to be considered a golden age and a period of peace, because relative peace existed throughout the European powers, and also many new inventions were making lives, especially upper-class lives, much nicer, and those upper-class lives were as yet unclouded by the dreaded income tax. Do you still have to pay the income tax? Yes. Oh dear, 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 dear. Well, coming at a time during the Third Republic and the German Empire, it was known in America as the Gilded Age, with America just recently coming out of the financial panic of 1873, and while in England it spanned two periods, the Victorian Age, which had begun with the ascension of Victoria to the throne in 1837, lasting until her death in 1901, when her son Edward VII came to the throne, heralding the Edwardian Age, which lasted, we generally consider that as having lasted until the Great War. How fitting, because it was such a beautiful time, that while champagne was not invented during this time, it was perfected. Haute couture in Paris, where fashion, of course, is so important, we'd seen a complete revolution in fashions. So if you remember the fashions of the 1860s, the Civil War, when skirts were supported 360 degrees round by crinolines, and then all of that fullness moved to the back, and we had the very large bustles. And then this was followed by the incredible fashions of the 1890s, with the very large leg of mutton sleeves, very tiny waist, and A-line skirts, to be replaced by this much simpler columnar fashion, topped off with large hats, large as the fortunes of those who wore them. Feathers and furs were all the rage, and of course, it was very important for people to be able to take the grand tour and to go to Europe and discover all of the beautiful cities. And it made things so much easier that now America and Europe were crisscrossed with train tracks connecting all of the major cities of Europe and America, making travel that much easier. Travel by train was rigorously divided by class: third class, second class, first class, but the very wealthy were commissioning their own private railway cars. Have you ever heard of the Pullman cars? Yes. Oh my goodness. So you could have 15-foot high ceilings, indoor plumbing, electricity, gas, mahogany, velvet, a full kitchen, all the accoutrements of a wonderful country home. Luxury was also the hallmark of the White Star Line, and the beautiful ships that were being launched were just incredible. And what was the most incredible ship? that was being produced was the Titanic. And it is said that second class on Titanic was even more luxurious than first class on any other ship that was then sailing. So it was also deemed to be very safe, unlike some other forms of transportation, such as the new motor car. Have any of you driven in a motor car? I've heard of so many accidents. And also there's the aeroplane. I can't even imagine taking that. Have any of you been in an aeroplane? Oh my goodness, does not seem very safe to me. And even train travel can be dangerous with, we have derailments and train crashes and even still, oh my goodness. They haven't improved much then, I guess. So anyway, my traveling companion, Miss Mary Haynes, and I had chosen to take the Titanic from France back to New York, because we were in France for the art salons. We'd been there for a couple of months, and we had heard nothing but news about this incredible ship. It was in the news every day. It was being built in Belfast in Ireland, and it was to have its maiden voyage without passengers from there over to Southampton, and then from Southampton its maiden voyage with passengers over to Cherbourg in France, where we boarded. And then, of course, we were on our way to Queenstown and then New York. So happily, Miss Haynes and I, when we boarded, she recognized one of the officers who had been a schoolmate, I guess. I can't remember his name. But he very happily took us on a tour of the ship. And we were able to go to all of the different decks. We saw so many of the available places to be on the decks. There was a pool. There was a gym with rowing machines and what are those other things called? Exercise bikes. Yes, exercise bicycles. I didn't make use of any of those things, but there was a hair salon, there was a telegraph office, there were libraries for first and class, second class, there were smoking lounges for the gentlemen, there were reading rooms, there were restaurants and cafes, and we were particularly happy to see a Parisian cafe. It was literally a Parisian cafe. It looked exactly like the cafes that we had been spending so much time in while we were in Paris. It had the chairs, the tables, the dishware, the French waiters, a French chef, and to our astonishment, there was a band. I'm sure you've heard about the band from the Titanic, being led by a Wallace Hartley. Everyone called him Wally. Wally Hartley was the band leader, and they were outside the Parisian cafe the day that we went, and they were playing a tune which was very popular in France at that time, and it was a waltz called Songe d'automne. And in fact, there is some dispute over what was the last song that the band played. And I'm sure that you've heard that it was Nearer My God to Thee. But Philip Mock, who was a survivor, said that he heard them playing Songe d'automne or Autumn. So I don't know. We'll never know. In any case, as we were touring, I noticed that they had lifeboats. And we had been given cork and canvas life vests, which was very reassuring. But when I was looking at the lifeboats, the officer who was taking us around, I noted to him, it doesn't look like there would be enough lifeboats for everyone on the ship. And he said, well, originally they had planned for 64 lifeboats, but that changed when the owners of the White Star Line came on board, and they were feeling that it looked a little crowded on the decks. And they made the decision to reduce the number of lifeboats down to 20, which, from my understanding, actually followed maritime regulations in that year, 1912. But of course, we know the disastrous results of that decision. Now, I do have something for you that I wanted to show you. I know there's a lot of people who are very interested in the nuts and bolts, literally, of the Titanic. And so I have for you the Titanic fact sheet. So if we could just hand these out, pass those back. And, oh, my fan, which is actually going to come in handy, I think. So, I was talking to you about, let's see, where is it? Here we are. So I was talking to you about things being divided by class, and of course the Titanic was divided by class. So Miss Haynes and I were able to, because we were first-class passengers, we were able to travel all around the ship and see the second-class accommodations and the steerage accommodations as well. But if you were a steerage passenger, you could not venture above decks. If you were second class, you could not venture into first class. And I want to give you an idea of the cost at that time so you can decide which sort of ticket you would purchase if you were on the Titanic. So, in 1912, the cost for a first-class suite, now this would be more than just a stateroom. This would be a couple of rooms along with a private bath. This would run you $4,350. In your time, that's about $76,000. Now that's for the suite. Miss Haynes and I chose a first-class berth at a much more reasonable $150, and this comes to about $2,600 in your time. Much more affordable, wouldn't you say? Yes. Second class came in around $60. For you, that would be a little over $1,000. And third class had a couple different price options, because if you were just a single person traveling alone, you might just get a berth, a bed. However, if you had a family, you might actually get a stateroom. So the prices could vary between $15 and $40, and this would be between $260 and almost $700. So those are the different prices that were available. Now also, the food was different. And I have a couple of examples of menus. So we have some third class here. Breakfast, dinner, tea. We have luncheon. We have breakfast, dinner for second class. I have the first class dinner menu, the second class dinner menu. So if we could just sort of, would you mind passing those around? Would you be so kind? So you'll see the differences. I did hear that in third class they had a very large dining room, which is probably maybe twice the size of this room. And they had lots of tables and benches, and there was a piano for entertainment. And I did hear that they had rabbit stew and carrots and apple pie. At least that's what I heard. So, in any case, Ms. Haynes and I were very excited to begin our trip. It was on April 10th. We enjoyed many of the amenities. We looked at the sauna, but we didn't dare use it. What else did we do? Oh, we strolled about the decks. We played some deck games. We looked in the library and the reading room. Anyway, on the evening of the 14th, April 14th, we had decided that we were going to have dinner in the Parisian Cafe. And while we were dining, we had the pleasure of listening to the band led by Wally Hartley. We listened to many of their songs, many of their numbers, and the reason they call them numbers is the band actually had a book, and instead of having just the titles, they would have numbers. So the band leader would say, play number 20, play number 17, play that number. And it was just an easier way to refer to the songs, I suppose. And after dinner, we went back to our stateroom where we both undressed, got ready for bed. I put on a robe because I had decided to read. Miss Haynes went to bed, went to sleep, and I can only tell you, from my perspective, that around 11:30 that night, I felt like a shuddering. I can't describe it any other way. It was as if I were sitting in a chair and someone was shaking the chair. That is what it felt like to me. And have you ever had that experience where for no reason at all, you have a fear in the pit of your stomach and you just feel that something is wrong? I had that. So I put my coat on over my robe and I opened the door to my stateroom, and as I went to exit, a young boy came barreling down, I think it's called the gangway, and he couldn't have been, I don't know, 15 years old, 16 years old, maybe a cabin boy. And the look on his face, the look in his eyes was absolutely terrifying to me. And I thought, there is something wrong. There is something wrong. So I went up and I happened to see a group of officers there, and one was the officer who had given us the tour of the ship a couple of days earlier. And I went over to him and I said, excuse me, is there something wrong? Is there something happening? And I don't remember everything that he said, but one of the things that he said to me was, don't worry, everything will be fine. We've struck an iceberg. And then I noticed that where the officers were, there was ice on the deck. And I thought, well, this accounts for the expression on the young boy's face. And he said to me, do me a favor, just go back to your room, put on your life vest, please waken Miss Haynes and tell her to do the same. And that was all he said. And that was all I needed to hear. So I went back and I wakened Mary and I said, Mary, we have got to go. And I explained what happened. She took one look at me and she said, you went out like that? And she was absolutely appalled that I had appeared in public without something that no respectable woman would go out without, which is... Yes. So, I've brought a visual. So, I just wanted you to get a visual of the fact that she was totally distressed, that not that we were sinking, that I hadn't put this on. And I grabbed it from her hands, I threw it back into the stateroom, and I said, Mary, we've got to go. And we went. So I'll just pass that around so you can just sort of feel it in your bones. So we went up on deck. Now I would like to dispel any rumors that it was a stormy night, that it was a wind-tossed, storm-tossed, wave-tossed ship. That was not the case. It was actually quite nice. It was a brilliant night, and I had never seen the stars twinkling like that in my life. And it was, of course, a cold October night. And what I did notice was that it was incredibly colder than it had been earlier. And this is very important. This was a meteorological phenomenon that happened when this very, very, very cold air met with the warmer
water, Gulf Stream.
The Gulf Stream, thank you. An effect was produced called scintillation. Now, have any of you ever been on a hot road on a hot summer day and you're looking out onto the horizon? What's happening to the horizon? It's shimmering. It looks watery, doesn't it? Well, this is sort of the same. The way the air was reacting was called scintillation, and because of this strange phenomenon, a couple of things happened. First of all, the air was affected so that it affected the way light traveled. So this is why the stars seem to be twinkling incredibly and more so than normal. The other thing is that it made things appear either closer or further away or smaller or larger. There was this size and distance distortion that also happened. So that was one thing. So we come up on the decks and there was no panic. All the lights were on, the electricity was still on, the band was playing, Women were still in their evening gowns with coats. Men were still in their tails and their top hats and coats. People were drinking champagne. People were talking and laughing. There was some confusion. On either side of the ship, things were happening, though. There were officers who were trying, and crew who were trying to get the women to get into the lifeboats. Now, let's imagine that we're on the deck of the Titanic, and it is a very calm, albeit cold, April evening, and you're looking down into the North Atlantic, and it's very, very far down. We're several stories up. The women did not want to get into the lifeboats without their husbands. And most famously, Mr. and Mrs. Isidore Straus, the owners of Macy's, she refused to go without her husband. And the two of them perished together because he wouldn't get in. He was actually invited to get into one of the lifeboats. And the reason was because since the women were refusing to get into the boats, the crew, in frustration, was saying to the husbands, all right, just get in. Just get in. So that's why there were so many first-class men who survived, because, of course, first class was being loaded first. Now, so many of the women were just looking down. So Mary and I did actually get into a lifeboat. And let me tell you, being lowered over the side, we had no drills. We had no experience. We didn't even really know how to put on the cork and canvas life vest very well. But we did get in a lifeboat, and going over the side was terrifying because it would jostle and turn, and you thought you were going to be dumped into the water, which was a terrifying prospect. And finally we made it down, and the crew that was manning our lifeboat began to furiously row us away from the Titanic. Why would they do this?
So you don't go down when it's...
Yes, they were afraid that the suction, when it became apparent that the Titanic was in fact sinking, that when she sank completely, the suction would pull all of the lifeboats down with her and everyone would perish. So we were about a quarter of a mile from the ship, and we were watching, and you could see the people on the decks. You could see the flares that were going up. And at one point, I was looking off into the horizon, and a flare went up, and I said to Mary, who was seated next to me, do you see what I'm seeing? And we had both seen what appeared to be a ghost ship. We saw the black silhouette of a ship that didn't seem like it was very far away in the distance. And I had such an overwhelming sense of relief because, as the officer had explained to us about the lifeboats are not meant to carry everyone on the ship. They're merely for transporting the passengers from one disabled ship to a rescue ship, and then they would go back for more people and keep going back. So that was the idea. And I thought, oh my goodness, thank you. There's a ship waiting to pick us up. Little did we know. So as we were watching, and we could hear strains of music and laughter and talking coming across the waves, and then all of a sudden, there was the loudest bang or crack. I don't even know how to explain. And something happened that we could not believe our eyes. There was a massive explosion, and the Titanic broke in two. And at that point, we could no longer hear the music. We could hear screams. And at that point, we did see people falling, jumping from the railings into the water. Now, many of us in the lifeboats, including famously Mrs. Maggie Brown, who you might know as Molly Brown, the unsinkable Molly Brown, although she wasn't known like that at that time, we tried to exhort the crew members to row us back to the Titanic to pick people up, but they absolutely refused. And Mrs. Brown was basically told to sit down and shut up. Why would the crew refuse to go back to pick people up? They were afraid that people in their panic would swamp the boats and everyone would be lost. And the rest of us had to live with survivor's guilt for the rest of our lives as we watched for the longest 15 minutes of our lives as these poor people were in the water, and little by little they got quieter and quieter. The North Atlantic is so cold that you could only survive about 10 to 15 minutes in the water at that time before you froze to death. And later, when people were fished out of the North Atlantic, they would find mothers clutching babies. They would find musicians clutching their instruments. And to the undying shame of the White Star Line, they actually billed the families of the drowned musicians for their uniforms. Yes, they actually sent their families bills for the uniforms. So I want to dispel a couple of myths. First of all, I've heard a couple people say that our captain, Captain Edward J. Smith, committed suicide when the Titanic sank, and that is not true. His first mate, however, did put a bullet in his head. Captain Smith, he was washed off the deck at one point, and he was washed very close to a lifeboat, and hands reached out to pull him on into the boat. He pushed away from the lifeboat and said, "I'm going back to the ship." Now, I do not consider this suicide, because what was Captain Smith doing? Yes, he was performing the time-honored duty of the captain of the ship to go down with the ship. And this was a very sad turn of events, because Captain Edward Smith was a very well-known ship captain at that time. And his captaincy of the Titanic was a reward. It was coming at the end of a long career, and it was meant to be, no pun intended, his last voyage. Nobody thought it would literally be his last voyage. So another thing that I heard was that the British spiritualist William Stead was on board. Do you know what a spiritualist is? Spiritualism was a very popular movement in the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, where people believed that they could contact the dead. And this British spiritualist, and I have an account that I would like to read to you, he was on his way to New York, actually. He was on his way to New York at the invitation of President Taft to speak at a peace conference. And I was told that people said that he was sitting in the library smoking and reading a book because he knew that the Titanic was going to go down. And that is not true. One of the survivors actually saw him and the richest man on board, who was Jacob Astor, yes, that the two of them were floating on some piece of something, a door or some such thing, and he actually watched them as their feet froze and they actually let go and floated away. Now, the interesting thing about William Stead is that he wrote a tale called How the Mail Steamer Went Down in the Mid-Atlantic by a Survivor. And he wrote this in March of 1886. And in this story, he tells of a large steamship that sinks after colliding not with an iceberg, but with another ship. And many lives are lost due to a lack of lifeboats. And Stead wrote, "This is exactly what will take place if the liners are sent to sea short of boats." and that was happening. He also authored a novel called From the Old World to the New, and in this book, he describes the sinking of a ship in the North Atlantic after striking an iceberg. To add to the irony, the captain of the ship which picked up the survivors in his story was Edward J. Smith, the eventual captain of the Titanic. Now, there's another tale, and I want to share this with you. It was an American named Morgan Robertson who 14 years before the sinking of the Titanic in 1898 wrote a novel called Futility. It was a novel about the largest ship ever built, and this is before the Titanic was built, hitting an iceberg in the Atlantic Ocean on a cold April night. The fictional ship was called Titan, and the Titanic were very similar in design, and their circumstances were alike. Both ships were labeled unsinkable. So, now, a couple of things that we need to talk about is the fact that there were many people on that ship that were not supposed to be on the ship. And the reason for this was that they had made such a big deal about the maiden voyage of the Titanic. And unfortunately, very close to that time, there was a coal strike. And they were afraid, the White Star Line was afraid, that if the Titanic didn't have enough coal, that she would stall in the middle of the North Atlantic, and there were all these famous and wealthy people on board. Can you imagine what that would have done for their public relations? Nightmare. So what they did was they canceled another voyage, and maybe even two, and they took the passengers and the coal from there and transferred them to the Titanic. So there were many passengers on the Titanic who had not actually booked passage on the Titanic, which was very sad. Now, there were other people who did book passage on the Titanic, but were not on board. And one of those was very important to us ladies, because you know that there are just those times every once in a while when you just have to have chocolate. And if this man had been on board the ship that night, it would have been very bad for us. Who was it? Hershey. Yes, Milton Hershey had booked passage. He actually put a deposit down on passage on the Titanic for April 10th, 1912. However, his wife, they were already in Europe, and his wife became ill. And he also had received news that there were some problems at the factory. And so they actually left in March, taking another ship. Now, waiting for us in New York was a very important man who had actually invented the wireless equipment that was on board that night. And his name is Marconi. And we'll talk a little bit more about him. Now, another man who was supposed to be on board but was not, was a very wealthy man by the name of Vanderbilt. And I have another sheet here. Alfred Vanderbilt. But you know, I think God had decided that this man was going to go down with a ship, because he was actually on the Lusitania when it was torpedoed in, I think, 1915. So God said, I said you're going to go down with a ship, you're going to go down with a ship. In any case, there were several theories about why the Titanic sank, and I know you're going to laugh at some of them. One theory was that the Astor party, along with Mrs. Brown, had been in Egypt, and so there was a cursed mummy on board, and that's why the Titanic sank. No. Also, that the Hope Diamond was on board and it was cursed, and that's why, no, none of that was true. That they had sealed up workers in the hull, and their spirits were haunting the ship, and that is what caused it. 2 people did die building the Titanic, but they weren't sealed into the hull. Another thing was that someone had scrawled across the stern, "We defy God to sink her," and so he did. No. And then the most interesting theory to me was that the bottle of champagne used to christen the ship did not break, and so therefore the Titanic sank. Well, it's an interesting theory, but the White Star Line did not use bottles of champagne at all for any of their ships. But they did seem to have a superstition about the number 13, because there was no cabin 13 on the Titanic. However, there were 13 honeymooning couples. So I don't think 13 was the problem, because we struck the iceberg on the 14th, we sank in the 15th in the year 1912. So I don't think 13 was the problem. So why did we sink? So let's get to that. First of all, you remember I told you about the scintillation. What was interesting to me was that the crew member in the crow's nest had no binoculars as they were looking out and did not see the iceberg, or if they saw it, they thought it was much smaller than it actually was. And we were coming at it quite quickly, and we were not, however, able to avoid it, and instead of hitting it head on, which might have actually been better, we grazed along the side. So there's a couple things about that. Number one, I have heard people say that Captain Smith was irresponsibly going too fast because he was trying to break some sort of record. And that's not true. However, in the hold of the ship, there were coal stores. That was how the ship was powered. And sometimes what happened on steamships was that a flame or a hot coal or something would come back out of the furnace and get lodged in the coal stores, and it would start a fire amongst the piles of coal. Well, what do you do about a fire with the coals? You can't douse them with water, because then you would ruin the coal. So the solution is to shovel it into the furnace. What happens when you shovel more coal into the furnace? You go faster, but you don't really have a choice. And the fire was burning so hot that one of the walls of the compartments was damaged. They knew about it, and they had repaired it, they'd even painted it, but it had ruined the integrity of that one wall. So it had always been said of the Titanic that if one compartment was breached, she would not sink. 2, she would not sink. 3, she would not sink. If that 4th compartment went, she would sink. And that's exactly what happened. The strength of the water coming through was absolutely impossible for that wall to hold, having already been damaged as it was. So that's another thing. So we also talked about Marconi, and we did have wireless equipment on board. So what happened? Well, I told you that there were flares going up and that we had seen a ship. We did see a ship. It was not a figment of our imagination. The ship was the Californian. Was the Californian the ship that came to rescue us? No. We were rescued by the Carpathian, hours after the ship had already sunk. What was the Californian doing? The Californian had seen us, but thought we were a much smaller ship, that we couldn't possibly be the Titanic. The flares that were going up, they thought it was a party. The signal that was being sent, there was a large lamp that could be used to send a Morse code signal. And the original signal that was sent was CQD. CQD. In French, this is CQD. CQ is the abbreviation of sécurité, security. And the D for détresse, distress. So security, distress. When that didn't work, they sent the new signal that was being promoted, which is SOS. And some people think that it was called that because it was save our souls, save our ship. It was none of that. SOS did not stand for anything. It was chosen purely because people thought that it would be easy for those not trained as radio operators to use it. And I bet you can tell me it's 3 dots. 3 dashes, 3 dots. See? And we don't even use Morse code anymore. So it was esteemed that if something happened to the wireless operator, anyone would be able to send a distress signal. So this was sent. The Californian had received some garbled messages, but the lamps that were being used, they couldn't read the message at all because of the scintillation that was happening in the atmosphere. It wasn't coming across as an intelligible message. And to make matters worse, the wireless operator ended up going to bed. And so he never received the latest messages. So when that happened, it was just a disaster. And the Californian stayed put because of the floating ice. And the captain of that ship, did not come until hours later after we'd already been picked up by the Carpathian, which took 4 days to get us to New York. And they didn't find any survivors. And that captain was absolutely roasted for the rest of his life and tried to clear his name for the rest of his life for not coming to the aid of the Titanic. Because if he had come, probably everyone on that ship would have been saved. So, very sad turn of events. Now, in addition to that, I would like to go back to the theory about the songs. And what was the song that you thought had been played?
Near my God.
There we go. Okay. So I'm going to try to use this newfangled contraption here. So I'm going to play for you first the waltz that Miss Haynes and I listened to. If anyone knows how to waltz, you're more than welcome. Now, as I said, this song was a number in the book. You can see why it was so popular in Paris. Okay, now I'm going to play for you Nearer My God to Thee, which was not in the book. Can you hear it? And I would like to tell you one more story. There was a little girl who lay dying in the room at the Salvation Army mission in Scotland. The officer in charge was summoned. "Captain," she said, "hold my hand. I'm so afraid. Can't you see that big ship sinking? Look at all those people drowning. Someone called Wally is playing a fiddle and coming at you." The captain looked around and saw nobody. But then he heard the downstairs door click open. And when he went to investigate, He felt someone whisk past him, briny wet. The captain leapt upstairs again and into the little girl's room. "Mother has come to take me to heaven," she said, and then she died. The captain heard the downstairs door latch click once more. When telling his tale, he added, "Some hours later, the whole world was startled by the tragedy of the Titanic. Among those drowned was Wally Hartley, whom I knew well as a boy. I had no knowledge of his going to sea or having anything to do with any ship. On that night of April 14th into the 15th, 1912, in a few seconds of legendary hubris, the unsinkable collided with the unthinkable, and the first lesson of the 20th century began." I want to thank you for having me here tonight, and if you have any questions, I would be more than happy to answer them. Thank you very much. Thank you.